Liam sat back in his plush seat, a far cry from the chaos that had preceded his flight. The world outside the private jet's windows was a blur of clouds, but inside, the cabin was calm, almost serene. His tailored suit fit perfectly, the fabric catching the light as it shifted. As a successful entrepreneur, he'd long gotten used to the luxury, the rarefied air of private aviation, but today, something felt off. He wasn't sure why, but as the plane cut through the sky toward its destination, the sensation of unease lingered. It wasn't the kind of thing he could easily describe, but there it was. Something just didn't sit right. He had just wrapped up a string of high-stakes meetings, each one leaving him more exhausted than the last. The hours spent strategizing, negotiating, and convincing had taken their toll, and all he wanted now was a quiet, uninterrupted flight. But that wasn't the reality he'd been met with. In the moments before boarding, he'd noticed something unusual, an air of tension in the terminal. Little things, like the overzealous staff and passengers who were whispering behind his back. But what did it mean? He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the briefcase resting at his side. Inside was a proposal that could change everything for his company. It was his latest venture, and if successful, it would expand his empire beyond the continents he'd already conquered. But as he adjusted in his seat, trying to make himself comfortable, his mind returned to the strange feeling. It wasn't long before a flight attendant entered the cabin. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture rigid with the kind of professionalism Liam had seen countless times. But as she walked down the aisle, something caught his attention. The look in her eyes wasn't just one of efficiency, it was something else, something colder. He had seen that expression before, but he couldn't quite place it. She approached him, a clipboard in hand, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice clipped, "I just need to confirm a few details for the flight." Liam nodded, smiling politely, though something about the way she said his name rubbed him the wrong way. It was as though she wasn't just doing her job, but was scrutinizing him. "Of course," he replied, his tone warm but guarded. He hadn't had time to study the staff before boarding, but now that he had a moment, he took note of her. Mid-30s, blonde, sharp features. Her name tag read, Jessica. Jessica's eyes narrowed as she checked the information on her clipboard. There was a pause, a flicker of irritation crossing her face, and then she continued. "It appears there's been some confusion with your seating assignment. It says here that you were booked in first class, but I'll need to confirm with the captain if that's possible." Liam felt a flash of annoyance. It was just a minor issue, something that could be easily resolved, but the way she had spoken, so condescendingly, set his nerves on edge. He wasn't one for confrontation, but her attitude left him wondering what her problem was. Still, he kept his composure. "I'm sure it's just an oversight," he said calmly. "Perhaps I can move to a different seat if it's more convenient for the crew." But Jessica didn't seem to be listening. Instead, she glanced over his shoulder at the other passengers, making a point of scanning the cabin with a look of disapproval. "We have a system," she said, her voice firm now, as though she were talking to a child, "and you'll need to follow it. Please remain in your seat while I speak to the captain." Liam's patience was starting to fray. He hadn't asked for special treatment, but he wasn't going to tolerate being spoken down to, especially not after the long day he'd had. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could get a word out, Jessica took a step closer. Her hand shot out, and without warning, she slapped him across the face. The sound of the impact echoed in the cabin. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. Liam sat there, stunned. He could feel the sting on his cheek, the sudden shift in the atmosphere, and the murmurs from the other passengers. Jessica, for her part, stood there with wide eyes, her hands still hanging in the air, as if she had no idea what had just happened. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Liam reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his business card, and handed it to her. "I think you might want to take a closer look at who you're talking to," he said, his voice ice cold. Jessica stared at the card, her face blanching as she read the words, "Liam Carter, CEO and owner of Sky High Enterprises." The realization hit her like a freight train. She opened her mouth to apologize, but the words stuck in her throat. The silence that filled the cabin was thick with tension as the truth settled in. The man she had just slapped was no ordinary passenger. He was the owner of the very plane she worked on. Liam didn't say another word. He simply leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving hers. Jessica, meanwhile, stood frozen, her mind racing. The plane hummed around them, but inside, the world felt as if it had just shifted. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. The slap had been impulsive, a rash move born out of frustration, but the man she had just struck wasn't some ordinary frustrated passenger. No, he was the owner of the entire plane. Liam Carter. Her eyes flicked to the business card he had handed her, her fingers trembling as she slowly took it. The name printed on it was clear, bold, impossible to ignore. She had seen the name before. Carter Enterprises was a powerhouse. Liam Carter was a self-made billionaire, one of the most successful entrepreneurs of their generation. She had heard his name tossed around in the news, in business circles, but this wasn't the kind of person she ever expected to cross paths with, let alone slap across the face. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Jessica could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze on her. The murmurs had already started, hushed whispers and curious glances exchanged between the other flight attendants and the passengers. Every pair of eyes seemed to be trained on her, waiting for her to do something, anything to fix the catastrophe she had just created. "Mr. Carter," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at the card in her hand, then back at him, her face flushing with mortification. I didn't mean to. I didn't know." Liam was calm, disturbingly calm. He didn't even flinch when she apologized, nor did he seem to show any sign of anger. He simply leaned back in his seat, his eyes not leaving hers, his expression unreadable. "I know you didn't," he said softly, but his voice had an edge to it that sent a chill through her. "But it's a little too late for that, don't you think?" The words stung, even though they weren't shouted or full of venom. It was his cool, controlled demeanor that made them even sharper. Jessica felt like she was sinking into the plush carpet beneath her, her face burning with shame. She had seen her share of rude, entitled passengers, and she had dealt with them all. But none of them had ever been the owner of the plane. None of them had ever been someone she had just slapped. She tried to think of something to say, something to fix this, but her mind was a blank. She knew the rules. Never get personal, always maintain professionalism, never lose control. But in that moment, she had failed in every possible way. Liam took a slow breath, his gaze never leaving her. He didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity, just allowing the weight of the silence to hang in the air. The other passengers continued to whisper in low tones, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. Jessica wished the floor would swallow her whole, but there was no escape. Finally, Liam broke the silence. "I'm going to give you a chance to fix this. Jessica," he said, his tone still measured, but with a hint of something else. "I could have you removed from this flight. I could call the authorities, have you escorted off the plane in front of everyone. I could make sure your career ends before you even leave this jet. But I'm not going to do that." Jessica's stomach turned as his words sank in. He could do all of that, and he had every right to. She had struck him, disrespected him in the most humiliating way possible. Yet, here he was, giving her a chance. It was almost worse than being fired on the spot. It felt like he was toying with her. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg for his forgiveness, but Liam held up a hand, silencing her. "Instead," he continued, "I'm going to teach you a lesson, not just about respect, but about understanding who you're dealing with. You think you can slap someone and walk away with no consequences? You're wrong. You don't just work for anyone on this plane, Jessica. You work for me." His words hit her like a ton of bricks. He worked for me. That simple statement put everything in perspective. This wasn't just about her temper getting the best of her. This was about the power dynamics she had misunderstood. Liam leaned forward, his expression hardening. "You've got a choice, Jessica. You can apologize, you can take responsibility for your actions, and we can move forward from this. Or you can make this harder on yourself than it already is. The choice is yours." Jessica's mind raced. She had no idea how to get out of this. She was completely out of her depth. She had thought she was in control of the situation, but now it felt like the floor had been pulled out from beneath her. Every instinct screamed at her to beg for his forgiveness, to grovel, but something inside her, some shred of dignity, told her she couldn't do that, not like this. She took a deep breath, her heart still racing. The humiliation stung, but there was a tiny flicker of resolve deep within her. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't apologize just for the sake of her job, but she would make it right. She had to. Liam watched her silently, waiting for her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but low. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. That was uncalled for. I'll accept whatever consequences you deem necessary." For a moment, she wasn't sure if he would accept her apology or dismiss her. But then he nodded, almost imperceptibly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Good," he said simply. "You've got potential, Jessica. I'll give you a chance to prove it." It was the first sign of mercy he had shown. But Jessica knew this was far from over. She had only just begun to understand the kind of man she was dealing with. The tension inside the cabin was unbearable. Jessica stood near the front, watching Liam Carter through the corner of her eye, trying to steady her breath, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, the weight of her mistake pressing down on her chest. The other passengers were quietly observing, no one daring to make a sound. Their eyes flicked between Jessica and Liam, their silence adding to the crushing discomfort that settled over her. She had thought it would be just another flight, just another day. But everything had shifted in an instant. The slap, the stunned silence, the revelation of Liam's identity, it had all unraveled in a way she couldn't have predicted. Now, as the minutes ticked by, she had no idea what he was thinking. Was he angry? Was he plotting his next move? She couldn't tell. His calm demeanor didn't give anything away. Liam hadn't spoken since his last words to her, and that silence had only deepened Jessica's anxiety. She had apologized, acknowledged her mistake, but what would that really change? The damage had been done. She had humiliated herself, and it wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a slap to her entire career. The weight of it was starting to sink in. She had never been in a position like this before, and part of her wondered if this was the end of everything. The intercom crackled to life, pulling her from her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet. Please make yourselves comfortable, and we'll be around shortly with drinks." The flight attendant's voice was calm, unaffected, but to Jessica, it felt distant, as if the world around her was in a vacuum. The passengers resumed their murmurs, but Jessica was no longer part of their world. She had retreated into her own mind, replaying every moment of the confrontation over and over. Each time, it became more surreal. She couldn't stop the images of the slap, her outburst, the stunned look in Liam's eyes. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shouted at her, but that quiet intensity was worse than any anger she could imagine. It was as if he was waiting for her to crack, and she felt like she was. She couldn't help but glance over at Liam again. He was seated now, his posture relaxed, but there was a certain stillness to him that made him seem even more powerful. His dark eyes were focused on his phone, typing out messages with a quick, deliberate precision. It wasn't the kind of casual, distracted texting that most people did. It was purposeful. Each tap on the screen seemed to carry some weight, some hidden meaning, and Jessica couldn't help but feel like she was being judged with every click. At that moment, the door to the cockpit opened, and another flight attendant appeared in the aisle. She looked at Jessica, giving her a tight-lipped smile, but didn't say anything. It was the kind of smile that said everything. "You've messed up. You've embarrassed all of us." Jessica looked away, not wanting to meet her colleague's gaze. Then, without warning, Liam's voice broke through the quiet. "Jessica." It was soft, but it carried an unmistakable command. She turned to face him, her heart racing, unsure of what was coming next. "I think we should have a word," Liam said, his tone calm but firm. There was no anger in his voice, but something in the way he spoke made her stomach drop. She nodded, swallowing hard, and took a few tentative steps toward him. The rest of the passengers were watching her now, their eyes full of curiosity. She could feel their judgment, but she forced herself to ignore it. When she reached Liam's seat, he didn't immediately speak. He simply gestured for her to sit down across from him. Hesitant, she lowered herself into the seat, keeping her eyes on the floor. She was acutely aware of how she must look. nervous, small, insignificant. Liam didn't look at her for a moment, his gaze fixed on the window. He let the silence hang between them, making her wait. Every second felt like a question she couldn't answer. "You know," he said suddenly, "you have a lot of potential, Jessica. I've been watching you since you first boarded this plane." Her heart skipped a beat. I... What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Was this some kind of test? Was he toying with her? "You're good at what you do," Liam continued, his voice cool. "You've been working this flight with precision, but that attitude you just showed, it's the kind of thing that could derail everything. One mistake, and you lose it all." Jessica swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. The thought of losing everything, of having her job taken away because of one outburst, was a real, terrifying possibility. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something in her defense, but Liam raised a hand. "I don't want an apology anymore, Jessica," he said. "What I want to see is your resolve. I want to see if you can own up to what you did, not just with words, but with actions." She looked up at him, confusion swirling in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked. Liam leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You've just made a very public mistake, and it's up to you how you handle it from here. The way you carry yourself, the way you deal with consequences, those will define who you are. Are you going to let this moment break you, or are you going to rise above it?" The challenge was clear, the implications of his words heavy. She wasn't just fighting for her job anymore. She was fighting for herself. Could she prove she was more than just a flight attendant who'd made a foolish mistake? Could she show him and everyone else that she had the strength to turn things around? Jessica sat in silence, the weight of Liam's words pressing down on her. She realized that this moment wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. But what would she do next? The answer was up to her. The flight stretched on, but Jessica hardly noticed the passing time. The hum of the engines, the soft shuffle of passengers as they made their way to the restrooms, the clink of glasses being refilled, all of it faded into the background. All she could focus on was Liam Carter's words, echoing in her mind like a haunting mantra. "Are you going to let this moment break you, or are you going to rise above it?" She hadn't expected a second chance. In her mind, the slap was an unforgivable mistake. When it happened, the last thing she thought about was redemption. It was all instinct, frustration with the constant demands of the job, the stress of the flight, and the tension in the air. Now, in the aftermath, she realized how badly she had miscalculated. But what was Liam expecting from her now? She had apologized, she had accepted responsibility, but he hadn't let her off the hook. He was pushing her, testing her. The weight of his words settled on her chest like a heavy stone. Rise above it. How? How could she possibly rise above such a public mistake? The passengers had seen it. Her colleagues had witnessed it. There was no going back to the way things were. She had been humiliated. And yet, there was a spark of something else deep inside her, a quiet determination she hadn't realized she had before. Maybe it wasn't just about saving her job anymore. Maybe it was about proving to herself that she wasn't someone who would simply fade away when faced with failure. Minutes later, as she made her way down the aisle to prepare for the meal service, she noticed that the air around her had shifted. The passengers no longer treated her as just a flight attendant. It was as if they saw something different in her now, a vulnerability that wasn't there before. But there was something else too, a kind of quiet respect. Even though they hadn't heard her apology to Liam, there was an unspoken understanding. As she walked past them, her head held high, she could sense their eyes on her. Some were sympathetic, others were curious. Some, she was sure, still thought she was nothing more than an incompetent worker. It was clear from their glances that they hadn't yet decided whether she would redeem herself in their eyes. Jessica's hands gripped the service cart as she moved through the cabin, trying to steady herself. She had been a flight attendant for years, working her way up from the smallest, most demanding flights to the larger private jets. But nothing had prepared her this moment, the feeling of being watched, of being judged so openly. She had always prided herself on professionalism, on keeping a cool head, but the last few hours had shattered that illusion. As she began serving drinks, she couldn't avoid it any longer. Liam Carter's gaze. She caught him watching her from his seat, His eyes were intense but unreadable, studying her every movement, every decision. A part of her wanted to run away, to disappear from his scrutiny. But another part of her realized that this was her chance to prove something, not to him, not to the passengers, but to herself. She served the first passenger in the row, her hands no longer trembling. She smiled politely as she handed over the drink, a palais making small talk about the weather and the flight. The next few passengers she approached with the same composure, forcing herself to remain in control, even as the weight of her mistake lingered just beneath the surface. By the time she reached Liam's seat, she had collected herself, her posture straight, her expression neutral. But she could feel the heat of his eyes on her. It was impossible not to. He was the reason she was doing this. After all, the reason she was proving that she could rise above it all. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady as she approached, offering him a glass of wine. She was surprised at how calm she sounded. A few hours ago she would have stammered, avoided his gaze, but now she held herself with a quiet confidence. Liam looked up at her, and for a moment their eyes locked. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, but it was fleeting. He didn't immediately take the wine. Instead, he studied her, his gaze sharp, as if he were reading her. "You're doing better," he said quietly, his tone almost approving. There was no mockery, no condescension, just an acknowledgement. Jessica was taken aback. She hadn't expected praise. She didn't deserve it. But hearing it from him felt like the first glimmer of light in a long time. She hadn't realized how much she needed his approval until now. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft. She set the glass down on the table in front of him, but as she moved to walk away, she hesitated. For the first time, she felt as though she had the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at her all along. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice uncertain, "why didn't you just fire me? You had every right to do that." Liam didn't immediately respond. He took a slow sip from his glass, his eyes still fixed on hers. Finally, he spoke, his words measured and deliberate. "Because people make mistakes," he said simply, "and I believe in giving people a chance to prove themselves. You can't grow if you don't make mistakes and learn from them. But I also don't tolerate weakness. You've got to be strong enough to pick yourself up after you fall." His words hit her harder than she expected. You can't grow if you don't make mistakes. It was so simple, so obvious. But hearing it from him, from someone who had achieved so much, made her realize how much she had been holding herself back. She had thought that failure was something to fear, something to avoid at all costs. But now she saw it for what it was, an opportunity to grow. She nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I'll prove it to you, Mr. Carter. I won't let this be the end of me." He offered her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I believe you will." With that, Jessica turned and walked away, her steps more confident than they had been all day. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she had the strength to face whatever came next. The challenge wasn't over. It had just begun. As the hours passed, Jessica's focus remained sharp. The weight of the situation, the public humiliation, and the unexpected opportunity to redeem herself didn't fade, but it no longer felt as overwhelming. She moved through the cabin with a newfound sense of purpose, her actions deliberate, her professionalism intact. She could feel Liam's eyes on her from time to time, but instead of sending waves of anxiety through her, his gaze became a reminder of the challenge she had to meet. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was proving something, not just to him, but to herself. The cabin was quieter now, the lights dimming as passengers settled into a more relaxed state. Most of them had finished their meals, and the atmosphere had taken on a calm, almost contemplative tone. Jessica moved between the rows, checking in on passengers, offering refills, and handling the small details that made the experience seamless. She had always been good at this job, even before the slap, but now it felt different. Every interaction, every moment was tinged with a quiet intensity, a drive to show that she could handle anything that came her way. As she approached the back of the plane to check on the last few rows, she caught a glimpse of Liam once again. He was seated near the front, his head bent slightly over a tablet, absorbed in something. For a moment, Jessica wondered what he was thinking, what he saw when he looked at her. She could never truly know, not with someone as enigmatic as him. But she didn't need to. The truth was, she had come to realize that it wasn't about pleasing him, not really. It was about restoring her own sense of control. She had let her emotions dictate her actions earlier, letting frustration, fatigue, and the pressure of the job get the better of her. But now, with every task she completed, with every moment of calm professionalism, she was reminding herself that she was capable of handling far more than she had given herself credit for. At the back of the plane, she paused for a moment, looking out of the small oval window. The lights of the city far below glimmered in the distance, and the endless stretch of sky above seemed to go on forever. It was a rare moment of peace in a job that was often anything but. As she stood there, letting the vastness of the world outside sink in, she felt a quiet shift inside herself. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was truly in control of her destiny. It wasn't just about the flight or the moment with Liam. It was about the larger picture, about reclaiming her sense of self after the storm of embarrassment she had weathered earlier. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned, her back straightening instinctively as she saw one of her colleagues walking toward her. It was Sarah, one of the other senior attendants, and she had a look on her face that Jessica couldn't quite decipher. "Hey, Jessica," Sarah said, her voice warm but with an underlying edge. "Can we talk for a minute?" Jessica felt a small knot form in her stomach. She had no idea what Sarah wanted, but she had learned to expect the unexpected in her line of work. Still, she forced herself to smile, nodding. "Of course, Sarah. What's up?" Sarah's eyes flicked to the front of the plane where Liam was still seated before looking back at Jessica. "I just wanted to say that, well, you handled yourself really well today. After, you know." She trailed off, leaving the unspoken words hanging in the air. Jessica blinked, unsure how to respond. Was this an apology? A compliment? She wasn't sure what to make of it, but she could sense the sincerity in Sarah's voice. "You mean after what happened?" Jessica asked, her tone tentative. "Yeah," Sarah said, shrugging slightly. "I know it wasn't easy for you. A lot of people would have crumbled under that kind of pressure, but you didn't. You kept your head, and I respect that." Jessica felt a flicker of gratitude, but also a slight pang of discomfort. She hadn't been expecting this kind of acknowledgement from Sarah, especially after the way things had gone down earlier. But maybe, just maybe, this was a sign that she was starting to win back some of the respect she had lost in that one impulsive moment. "Thanks, Sarah," Jessica replied quietly. "It means a lot to hear that from you." Sarah gave her a small, knowing smile before glancing back at Liam again. "Just don't forget who you're dealing with. I don't care how nice he's being now, but that guy doesn't forget things. You might have bought yourself some time, but don't let it go to your head." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She had thought she was past the worst of it. The moment with Liam had been uncomfortable, but she had been doing everything right since then. But now, with Sarah's words, a seed of doubt was planted in her mind. Don't let it go to your head. She wondered what exactly Sarah meant by that. Was Liam just biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the hammer on her? Or was Sarah simply trying to caution her against being too complacent? Before Jessica could ask, Sarah gave her a quick pat on the arm and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The comment lingered, heavy and uncertain. Was Liam truly offering her a second chance, or was he simply playing a game of his own? Jessica shook her head, trying to push the thought out of her mind. She couldn't afford to get caught up in paranoia or doubt. She had worked too hard to reclaim her composure, and she wasn't about to let one conversation undo everything she had worked for. She turned back toward the front of the plane, her eyes once again meeting Liam's. He had returned to his tablet, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested he was still watching, still waiting. Jessica wasn't sure what he saw when he looked at her, but she was determined to show him that she was capable of more than just a second chance. She could prove to him that she was more than the mistake she'd made. With a deep breath, Jessica set her jaw and moved forward, determined to finish the flight on her own terms, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The rest of the flight passed in a blur, the cabin filling with the usual low hum of soft conversations and gentle laughter as the passengers settled into their seats. Jessica's thoughts, however, were anything but calm. She had hoped that after Sarah's words, she'd feel more grounded, more confident, but instead, a sense of unease gnawed at her. Was she truly on her way to redemption, or was she simply delaying the inevitable? Liam's presence lingered in her mind like a shadow, his calm demeanor and quiet observation serving as a constant reminder of her mistake. She couldn't shake the feeling that his forgiveness, or whatever it was he had extended to her, came with strings attached. Don't let it go to your head. Sarah's warning echoed in her thoughts, and she couldn't help but wonder if she was walking a fine line, balancing between proving herself and falling even deeper into trouble. As the plane began its descent into their final destination, Jessica moved through the cabin, preparing for landing. She double-checked seatbelts, stowed trays, and ensured that everything was in order. Her movements were mechanical now, a far cry from the frazzled state she'd been in earlier. Yet the unease still clung to her like a second skin. Liam's seat was close to the front, and as she walked past him, she couldn't help but glance over. His gaze met hers for a split second before he returned to his tablet, absorbed in whatever he was doing. Jessica couldn't decipher his expression, but there was something about the way he looked at her that unsettled her. It wasn't harsh, but it wasn't warm either. He was studying her, waiting for her next move. Miss? A voice interrupted her thoughts, pulling her back into the present. She turned to find a young woman looking up at her with a friendly smile. Yes. How can I help? Jessica responded automatically. I just wanted to thank you, the woman said, her eyes warm. I've been on many flights, but this has been the smoothest service I've had in a long time. You're doing a great job. Jessica was momentarily taken aback. Compliments from passengers were always nice, but after everything that had happened, this one hit differently. The kindness in the woman's voice was genuine, and it made Jessica feel like maybe, just maybe, she was doing something right after all. Thank you, Jessica replied, her smile softening. It means a lot to hear that. As the woman nodded and returned to her seat, Jessica took a deep breath, feeling a small glimmer of relief. Maybe she hadn't completely lost the respect of the passengers after all. Maybe the redemption she was searching for wasn't as out of reach as she'd thought. The seatbelt sign illuminated, and the final preparations for landing began. Jessica moved toward the front of the plane to make sure everything was secured for the descent. She checked with her colleagues, making sure everyone was on the same page. As the plane dipped lower, the tension in the air seemed to rise, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been earlier. The flight was almost over, and with each passing moment, Jessica felt herself inching closer to the end of the ordeal. Just as the plane's wheels touched down, the captain's voice came over the intercom, signaling the final stages of their arrival. The passengers' reactions were calm, a few murmuring their goodbyes, but Jessica was still focused. She couldn't help but take one last glance at Liam. This time, he wasn't looking at her. He had put his tablet away and was adjusting his seatbelt as they prepared to disembark. She couldn't shake the feeling that their interaction wasn't over, that this wasn't the end of their story. But in that moment, Jessica knew she had done everything she could. She had survived the flight, maintained her professionalism, and redeemed herself in ways she hadn't thought possible just hours before. She had risen above the initial chaos, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had regained control. The plane touched down smoothly, and the seatbelt sign clicked off. Passengers began to gather their things, some in a hurry to exit, others leisurely collecting their belongings. Jessica moved down the aisle, smiling at passengers as they made their way off the plane. As the cabin emptied, she took one last look around, feeling a strange sense of pride in how far she had come. The day had started with a mistake that had threatened to ruin everything, but it had ended with a quiet triumph. As she was preparing to leave the cabin herself, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Liam standing behind her, his expression unreadable. Her heart skipped a beat, wondering if this was the moment when everything came crashing down. Jessica, he said, his voice steady but not unkind. You did well today, better than I expected. Her stomach tightened, unsure if his words were meant to reassure her or to remind her that he was still watching. Thank you, she said, her voice small, but she held his gaze, refusing to back down. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once. Take care of yourself. With that, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Jessica standing there, a mixture of relief and uncertainty swirling in her chest. She didn't know what to make of his words, but something about the way he had spoken to her made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she had passed whatever test he had set for her. As the last few passengers disembarked, Jessica walked off the plane herself, her heart a little lighter. She had weathered the storm, proven her strength, and come out on the other side more resilient than she had been when the flight began. The world outside the airport terminal was bustling with activity, but for the first time in a long while, Jessica felt like she had truly found her footing again. The mistake, the embarrassment, the uncertainty, it was all part of the journey, part of what had shaped her into someone who could rise above it all. As she made her way through the terminal ready to head home, Jessica knew that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where she would stand tall, unshaken by the challenges ahead. She had learned that redemption wasn't just about proving others wrong. It was about proving to herself that she had the strength to overcome anything. And with that, Jessica walked into her future, ready to face whatever came next.